The restaurant was small, but it carried an air of quiet elegance. Soft yellow lights hung from the ceiling, reflecting gently off polished wooden tables. A large window at the front looked out toward a busy street where cars and people moved constantly, but inside the restaurant everything felt calm and peaceful. In the corner of the dining area stood a beautiful black piano. It was placed near a tall indoor plant and a small stage platform. Most evenings a hired musician would sit there and play soft melodies while customers enjoyed their meals. The music filled the room like a warm blanket, making conversations feel softer and the atmosphere more welcoming. But on this particular evening, the piano was silent. The musician who usually played had called in sick, so the instrument simply stood there, untouched. Some customers noticed the quiet difference, but most were busy talking, eating, or checking their phones. Among the restaurant staff moving between the tables was a young waitress. She wore the same uniform as the others. A simple white shirt, a black apron, and comfortable black shoes that had clearly seen many long shifts. Her job looked simple from the outside. She carried trays, poured water, cleaned tables, and greeted customers politely. But anyone who worked in a restaurant knew it was not easy. The hours were long, the pace was fast, and mistakes could happen quickly if someone was not careful. Even so, she did her work quietly and carefully. She moved quickly but gently between the tables, always trying not to disturb anyone. Most customers barely noticed her. That was normal in places like this. Waitresses and waiters often became invisible to people who were busy enjoying their dinners. Customers remembered the food, the atmosphere, and the company they came with, but rarely the people who served them. Still, she never complained. She had learned long ago that quiet patience was sometimes the only way to keep moving forward. Earlier that evening, she had arrived for her shift a little before sunset. The sky outside had been painted in soft orange and purple colors, and the air carried the cool feeling of the approaching night. She walked through the restaurant's back door and tied her apron like she had done hundreds of times before. The manager quickly gave instructions to the staff. "Tonight will be busy," he said. "We have several reservations and a few important guests. Make sure everything runs smoothly." Everyone nodded and returned to their stations. She began preparing the tables, placing glasses carefully and making sure each chair was straight. The restaurant slowly began filling with customers. Couples arrived for dinner. Friends gathered to celebrate small moments in life. Business partners sat down to discuss work over meals. The evening moved forward like any other night. But there was something slightly different about her routine. Every time she walked past the piano, her eyes briefly moved toward it. She never stopped. She never touched it. She simply looked for a moment, then continued walking. The piano was not just another piece of furniture to her. It carried memories. Years earlier, music had been a big part of her life. When she was very young, the sound of piano keys had often filled the small house where she grew up. Her father had loved music deeply. He believed music could express emotions that words sometimes could not. Their home had not been large or fancy, but there had always been a piano in the living room. It was old, and some keys had slight scratches, but to her it had once felt like the most magical object in the world. As a child, she would sit beside her father and watch his hands move across the keys. At first she only listened. Then one day he gently placed her small fingers on the keyboard. "Music is not about being perfect," he told her with a warm smile. "It's about feeling." Slowly, he began teaching her simple notes. At first the sounds were messy and uneven, but he never laughed or scolded her. Instead, he encouraged her to keep trying. Day after day, week after week, she practiced. The music in their home grew stronger. What began as simple notes slowly became beautiful melodies. Her father's eyes would light up with pride whenever she finished playing a song. Those were some of the happiest days of her life. But life does not always move in gentle directions. When she was older, difficult times came suddenly. Financial problems began to affect the family. Medical bills grew, and responsibilities increased. Eventually, after a long struggle, her father passed away. The house that had once been full of music became quiet. Without him, the piano felt different. For a while she tried to keep playing, but life forced her to focus on other things. Work became necessary. Bills had to be paid. Dreams slowly stepped aside to make room for survival. The piano in the house was eventually sold to help cover expenses. That day felt like closing a chapter of her life. Since then, she had rarely touched a piano. Years passed and she eventually found work in the restaurant. It was not the life she had once imagined, but it gave her stability. And strangely, the restaurant also had a piano. The first time she saw it, her heart had skipped slightly. For a moment she considered touching the keys when no one was around. But she stopped herself. Too much time had passed. She believed she had forgotten most of what she once knew. So instead, she kept her distance. Still, every time she walked past it, memories returned quietly. On this particular evening, the restaurant continued filling with people. The clinking of glasses and soft conversations created a gentle background noise. She carried a tray of drinks to a table near the window. "Here you go," she said politely, placing the glasses down one by one. The guests thanked her, barely looking up from their conversation. She smiled politely and moved on. A few minutes later, she passed the piano again. Her eyes moved toward it without thinking. The polished black surface reflected the warm lights of the room. The keys looked smooth and perfect, waiting silently. For a brief second, she imagined sitting there again. She imagined the familiar feeling of the keys under her fingers. Then the moment passed. She continued walking toward another table. Across the room, the manager was speaking quietly with another staff member. "Important guests are coming tonight," he said in a low voice. "Make sure everything is perfect." The staff nodded again. The atmosphere slowly grew more energetic as the evening progressed. More customers arrived. The kitchen became busier. Plates moved quickly from the kitchen to the dining tables. Orders were taken, drinks were poured, and laughter echoed softly across the room. Through it all, the piano remained silent in the corner. No one knew that the quiet waitress walking between the tables carried years of hidden music inside her heart. No one knew that behind her calm smile and careful movements was someone who once spent hours lost in melodies. And certainly no one in the restaurant could imagine that before the night ended, that same silent piano would become the center of everyone's attention. For now, it simply waited in the corner. Quiet, patient, and unnoticed. Just like the waitress herself. The evening continued to grow busier as the hours passed. The restaurant was now almost full. Soft conversations floated through the air, mixed with the quiet sound of plates and glasses being placed on tables. The warm lights made the room feel comfortable, and the smell of freshly cooked food drifted from the kitchen. The waitress moved quickly between tables, carrying trays and taking orders. She had already been on her feet for several hours, but she stayed focused on her work. In a restaurant like this, the busiest time always came after sunset. Near the entrance, the manager suddenly straightened his posture when the front door opened. 3 men walked inside. The way they entered immediately drew attention. Their clothes were expensive and perfectly fitted. Their shoes shined under the lights. They spoke confidently as if they were used to being listened to. The manager quickly walked forward with a welcoming smile. "Good evening," he said politely. "Your table is ready." The guests nodded and followed him toward one of the best tables in the restaurant. It was located near the center of the room, where they could see almost everything around them. Some of the staff exchanged quick glances. Important guests often visited the restaurant, but these men clearly carried the presence of people who were used to power and influence. One of them in particular stood out. He appeared to be the one leading the group. His posture was relaxed but confident. His voice carried authority even when he spoke casually. The manager personally pulled out a chair for him. "Please enjoy your evening," he said before stepping away. In the kitchen area, the manager quietly spoke to the staff. "Make sure this table is taken care of," he said. "They are important." The waitress happened to be standing nearby when she heard this. The manager then turned toward her. "You will serve that table," he said calmly. She nodded without hesitation. Of course. It was not unusual for her to handle important guests. She was known among the staff for staying calm and polite even when customers were demanding. Still, something about this group made her slightly nervous. She picked up a menu and walked toward their table. As she approached, the men were already deep in conversation about business. Their voices were calm but serious. She stopped beside the table and greeted them politely. "Good evening. Welcome. May I bring you something to drink while you look at the menu?" The man leading the group looked up first. His eyes quickly scanned the room before returning to her. "Yes," he said. "Bring us sparkling water first." She nodded. "I'll bring that right away." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen area. A few minutes later, she returned with a tray holding several glasses and a bottle of water. She carefully poured the drinks for each guest. The men continued discussing business matters while she worked quietly. After placing the last glass on the table, she asked gently, "Are you ready to order? Or would you like a few more minutes?" The man who seemed to be leading the group leaned back slightly in his chair. "We'll order soon," he replied. "Give us a moment." "Of course," she said politely. She stepped away and continued serving other tables. From time to time, she glanced toward their table to make sure everything was going smoothly. The manager also kept an eye on them from across the room. About 15 minutes later, she returned to take their order. The men placed their requests confidently, choosing several of the restaurant's most expensive dishes. She wrote everything down carefully to avoid mistakes. "Thank you," she said when they finished. "Your food will be ready shortly." As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The man leading the group looked toward the quiet piano standing in the corner of the restaurant. He frowned slightly. "Is the piano broken tonight?" he asked suddenly. His question caught her off guard. "No," she said politely. "It's not broken." "Then why is no one playing it?" he asked. "The musician who usually plays is not here tonight," she explained. "He became sick earlier today." The man nodded slowly as if thinking about something. "A restaurant like this should never be silent," he said casually to his companions. "Music makes the atmosphere better." His friends agreed with small nods. Then his attention returned to the waitress. "You work here every day?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. He glanced again toward the piano. "Do you know how to play?" The question arrived so suddenly that she hesitated for a moment. Her first instinct was to say no, but something in her expression must have revealed uncertainty. The man noticed immediately. "You paused," he said with a small smile. "That usually means the answer is yes." She quickly tried to correct the moment. "I used to learn when I was younger," she admitted carefully. "But that was a long time ago." The men at the table looked interested now. One of them chuckled lightly. "So the restaurant does have a pianist tonight," he joked. She felt a wave of discomfort. "I'm sorry," she said politely. "I'm only here to serve the tables." But the man leading the group leaned forward slightly. "Come on," he said casually. "Just play something simple. It will make the room feel more alive." She shook her head gently. "I really can't. I haven't played in years." The conversation had already begun attracting quiet attention from nearby tables. A few customers glanced in their direction, curious about what was happening. The man did not seem bothered by the growing audience. "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "Just a few notes." She could feel the situation becoming uncomfortable. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said carefully, "but I should return to my work." She turned slightly, hoping the conversation would end. But before she could step away, the man spoke again. "Wait." His voice was calm but firm. She stopped. "You said you learned when you were younger," he continued. "That means the music is still somewhere in your memory." She felt her heart beat a little faster. "I'm not sure about that," she replied quietly. The man smiled slightly as if he enjoyed the challenge. "I think you are just being modest." His friends laughed softly. Around them, a few more customers had begun watching the conversation with interest. The waitress suddenly felt the weight of many curious eyes. She wished the moment would simply end so she could return to her normal routine. But the man seemed determined. "Tell you what," he said confidently. After we finish our meal, you play something for the room. Just one song. She immediately shook her head again. I really shouldn't. But the man leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the idea. It will be fun, he insisted. She tried to remain polite. I'm afraid I can't do that. For a moment the table became quiet. The man studied her expression carefully. Then he spoke in a lighter tone. All right, he said. We will discuss it later. She gave a small nod and quickly stepped away from the table. As she walked toward the kitchen, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Embarrassment, nervousness, and something else she had not felt in many years. The thought of touching a piano again. Across the room, the silent instrument still waited in the corner. And although no one realized it yet, the conversation that had just happened was about to change the entire evening. Very soon, the quiet restaurant would witness something no one expected, especially the man who had started the conversation in the first place. The evening continued moving forward, but something in the atmosphere had quietly changed. The restaurant was still full of soft conversations and clinking glasses, yet the waitress could not stop thinking about the conversation she had just had at the table in the center of the room. She tried to focus on her work. There were still many tables to serve, and the kitchen was sending out dishes quickly. Plates of warm food needed to reach customers while they were still hot. But every time she walked past the corner where the piano stood, her eyes moved toward it again. The memory of the man's question kept repeating in her mind. Do you know how to play? She had answered honestly, but she had hoped the subject would end there. Instead, it had created a situation she never expected. Across the room, the three important guests were now enjoying their meal. The dishes they ordered had arrived, and they seemed satisfied with the service. The man who had asked about the piano spoke confidently as he ate, often making his companions laugh. It was clear he was used to being the center of attention. From time to time, his eyes wandered around the restaurant, and more than once he glanced toward the piano. The waitress noticed this, and each time it made her slightly nervous. She reminded herself that the evening would end soon. The guests would finish their dinner, pay the bill, and leave like everyone else. Once they were gone, the strange moment would simply become another small memory from a long shift. At least that was what she hoped. About half an hour later, the plates on their table were nearly empty. The men leaned back in their chairs, satisfied with their meal. She approached the table again with a polite smile. Was everything all right? She asked. One of the guests nodded. The food was excellent. She began collecting the empty plates carefully, stacking them on her tray. The man who had first asked about the piano watched her quietly. When she finished clearing the table, she asked, Would you like dessert or coffee? The man smiled slightly. Coffee, he said. For all of us. Of course. She returned a few minutes later with 3 cups of fresh coffee. The rich smell filled the air as she placed each cup gently on the table. The men continued talking while slowly sipping their drinks. The restaurant had grown even busier now. More people had arrived, and the room felt full of life. Laughter and conversation mixed with the sounds from the kitchen. Still, one thing remained missing. The piano was silent. Eventually, the man set his cup down and looked toward the corner of the room again. Then he looked back at the waitress. You know, he said casually, this place still feels too quiet. She already knew what he meant. I'm sorry about the music tonight, she said politely. The musician should be back tomorrow. He shook his head slowly. But we talked about a solution earlier. Her heart sank slightly. She had hoped he had forgotten. I really don't think that's a good idea, she said gently. The man leaned forward with a relaxed smile. You said you used to play, he replied. Why not remind yourself? One of his companions chuckled. Yes, the man said. It would be entertaining. She felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. I'm sorry, she said again. I truly can't. It has been many years. By now, the conversation had started attracting attention again. A couple sitting at the nearby table turned their heads slightly. The man seemed completely comfortable with the growing audience. It's just a piano, he said. Not a stage in front of thousands of people. She forced a small polite smile, hoping the moment would pass. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said, "but I need to continue serving the other tables." She picked up the empty coffee pot from the tray and turned to leave. But once again his voice stopped her. "Wait a moment." His tone was still friendly, but there was determination behind it. She slowly turned back. The man rested his arm on the table and looked at her calmly. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When was the last time you played?" The question surprised her. She hesitated. "I don't really remember," she admitted quietly. 10 years? He asked. "Maybe. 15. Something like that." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then tonight is a good night to start again." A few nearby customers smiled, clearly finding the moment amusing. But for her, it felt uncomfortable. She had not touched a piano in so long that the idea of playing in front of strangers felt impossible. "I might make mistakes," she said honestly. "That's all right," the man replied. "Everyone makes mistakes." Another guest at the table added jokingly, "Maybe she's secretly amazing." The men laughed lightly. The waitress lowered her eyes for a moment. Memories were starting to return again. The feeling of piano keys under her fingers. The sound of music filling a room. But those memories also carried pain. Her father's voice. The quiet house after he was gone. The day the piano left their home. All of it came rushing back. She shook her head slightly. "I really shouldn't," she said. The man leaned back again, crossing his arms with a playful expression. "Are you afraid?" The word made her pause. She did not answer right away. He smiled. "There's nothing wrong with being afraid," he said. "But sometimes fear hides something interesting." The people at nearby tables were now openly watching. Even some of the restaurant staff had noticed the situation. The manager stood near the kitchen entrance, observing carefully. He understood that the man at the table was an important guest. If the situation turned negative, it could affect the restaurant's reputation. After a moment of thinking, the manager slowly walked toward them. "Is everything all right here?" he asked politely. The man turned toward him with a friendly grin. "Everything is perfect," he said. "We were just asking if your waitress could play the piano for the room." The manager looked surprised. He glanced briefly at the waitress. She immediately spoke. "I told them I'm not able to." But the man spoke again. "She says she learned when she was younger." The manager looked between them, clearly unsure what to do. He knew the guests were important, but he also knew he could not force his staff to do something uncomfortable. Still, the moment had already captured the attention of half the restaurant. The room felt quieter now. Everyone seemed curious about what would happen next. The waitress could feel dozens of eyes on her. She wished the floor would open and let her disappear. But the man remained calm and patient. "I'm not asking for a concert," he said. "Just one small piece." The manager hesitated. Then he looked gently at the waitress. "You don't have to if you don't want to," he said quietly. She appreciated his words, but the situation had already grown too big. Walking away now would feel awkward. The room was silent with curiosity. The piano waited quietly in the corner. And for the first time in many years, the possibility of playing again stood right in front of her. Her heart beat faster as she slowly looked toward the instrument. She took a deep breath. The next decision she made would change the entire night. For a few seconds, the entire restaurant felt strangely quiet. Conversations that had filled the room just moments ago slowly faded as more people began noticing what was happening. Some customers turned in their chairs. Others paused while holding their glasses or forks. Everyone seemed curious. The waitress stood still beside the table, feeling the weight of many eyes around her. She could hear the soft sound of dishes coming from the kitchen and the low hum of the lights above, but everything else felt distant. The man at the table watched her calmly, waiting for her answer. The manager also stood nearby, unsure whether to step in or simply let the moment pass. She slowly looked toward the piano again. The black instrument stood quietly in the corner, just as it had every night since she started working there. It had always been part of the background, something customers enjoyed while eating. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it was calling her attention. Her heart beat faster as memories began rising again. She remembered sitting beside her father when she was young, her small fingers trying to reach the keys. She remembered his gentle voice reminding her to relax and feel the music. For years she had pushed those memories aside because life had moved her in another direction. Now they returned all at once. She swallowed nervously and looked back at the table. "I might make mistakes," she said quietly. The man smiled. "That's completely fine," he replied. "Music doesn't need to be perfect." His calm attitude surprised her. She had expected him to be impatient or demanding, but he seemed more curious than anything else. Around them, the customers were still watching with interest. Some whispered to each other. The manager spoke gently. "If you'd like to try, you can," he said. "But only if you feel comfortable." She appreciated the kindness in his voice. Still, her hands felt slightly shaky. Playing again after so many years was not something she had ever imagined doing in front of strangers. But something inside her also felt strangely awake. The idea of touching the piano again brought a mixture of fear and excitement. She took a slow breath. Then, almost without realizing it, she nodded. "I'll try," she said softly. The reaction around the room was immediate. A few people smiled. Someone at a nearby table quietly clapped once in encouragement. The man at the table leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "Wonderful," he said. The waitress wiped her hands gently on her apron, trying to calm her nerves. Then she began walking toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The restaurant was no longer noisy. Most conversations had stopped completely now. Customers watched her with curious expressions as she crossed the room. Some people even shifted their chairs slightly so they could see better. She reached the small platform where the piano stood. For a moment she simply looked at it. Up close, the instrument looked even more beautiful. The polished surface reflected the soft lights above. The keys were clean and smooth, waiting patiently. She had passed this piano hundreds of times. But tonight was the first time she was standing directly in front of it. Her heart pounded gently in her chest. She slowly pulled the bench back and sat down. The moment she settled onto the seat, a strange feeling washed over her. Felt familiar, almost like returning to a place she had not visited in many years. The room remained completely quiet. Even the kitchen staff had stepped out slightly to watch from a distance. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment, taking another deep breath. Her mind raced with thoughts. What if she truly had forgotten everything? What if her fingers refused to move the way they once did? What if the music sounded terrible? The fear tried to creep into her mind. But then another memory appeared. Her father's voice. He had once told her something during a lesson. "Don't think too much," he had said gently. "Just listen to the music inside you." She closed her eyes for a moment. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed her fingers lightly on the keys. The cool, smooth surface sent a small shiver through her hands. It had been so long. For a second, she simply stayed there, letting her fingers rest on the piano. Across the room, the guests watched silently. The man who had started all this leaned forward slightly in his chair, curious to see what would happen. She pressed the first key very softly. A single clear note floated through the restaurant. The sound echoed gently across the room. It was simple, but it was beautiful. She pressed another key, then another. At first the notes were slow and careful, almost like someone testing the water before stepping into a lake. Her fingers moved cautiously, trying to remember patterns that had once felt natural. The room remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. After a few seconds, something began to change. Her fingers started moving with more confidence. The music slowly began forming into a melody. It was not loud or dramatic. Instead, it was soft and emotional, like a quiet conversation between the piano and her memories. The melody grew smoother with every note. People in the restaurant began exchanging surprised glances. This was not the hesitant playing of someone who had forgotten everything. This was something deeper. Her fingers began moving faster across the keys. The melody became richer and more expressive. It was as if years of silence were slowly breaking apart, releasing music that had been waiting patiently inside her. She no longer noticed the crowd watching her. She no longer felt embarrassed or nervous. Her entire focus was on the piano. The music carried her away from the restaurant, away from the tables and trays and long shifts. For a few beautiful moments, she felt like the young girl again sitting beside her father in their small living room. The notes flowed naturally now. Soft highs and deep lows blended together into something that felt alive. Across the room, the audience sat completely still. Even the man who had encouraged her to play looked surprised now. He had expected a few simple notes. What he was hearing instead was something far more powerful. The quiet waitress who served tables every night was revealing a talent no one had noticed before. And the music was only just beginning. The melody continued to flow through the restaurant, growing stronger with every passing moment. What had started as a few careful notes had now turned into something rich and emotional. Her fingers moved across the keys with a natural rhythm, as if the years between her last performance and this moment had simply disappeared. At first, the people in the restaurant had only been curious. But now their curiosity had turned into something else. Amazement. The quiet room was filled with music that felt deep and alive. Each note seemed to carry emotion, rising and falling in a way that made people forget their conversations, their meals, and even the time. The waitress herself barely noticed the room anymore. Her focus was completely on the piano. Memories continued guiding her fingers. The small lessons from her childhood returned naturally, like a language she had once spoken every day. She remembered the gentle corrections her father used to give her. She remembered the way he would smile when she finished a difficult piece. It felt as if those memories were sitting beside her now, quietly guiding the music. Across the restaurant, customers leaned forward in their chairs. Some people rested their elbows on the tables, watching with wide eyes. A few quietly lifted their phones to record the moment, careful not to interrupt the performance. The restaurant manager stood near the kitchen entrance, completely still. Earlier he had worried that the situation might become awkward for everyone. But now he realized something very different was happening. The room had become part of a moment no one expected. Even the kitchen staff had stepped out slightly to listen. One cook stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, nodding slowly to the rhythm. Near the center of the room, the wealthy guest who had asked her to play sat silently. Earlier he had made the suggestion almost playfully, thinking it would be a brief moment of entertainment. Now his expression had changed completely. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together while watching the performance with deep focus. The confidence in the music surprised him. This was not someone nervously pressing random keys. This was skill. Real skill. He glanced briefly at his companions, who were also watching with stunned expressions. One of them whispered quietly, "She said she hasn't played in years." The man nodded slowly, still focused on the piano. "Yes," he replied softly. "But talent like this doesn't disappear." At the piano, the melody shifted again. Her hands began moving faster, building a stronger rhythm. The notes rose higher and then fell into deep tones that filled the entire room. The sound carried emotion that everyone could feel, even if they could not explain it. Some people closed their eyes while listening. Others smiled quietly. The music was not just impressive, it felt personal, as if every note carried a story. And in many ways it did. Without realizing it, she was pouring years of hidden feelings into the performance. The struggles she had faced, the dreams she had once held, the quiet memories of her father. All of it seemed to flow into the melody. Her fingers danced across the keys now, confident and smooth. At one point the music softened again, becoming gentle and slow. The shift made the room even quieter. A couple sitting near the window held hands while listening. At another table, an older man wiped the corner of his eye with a napkin. The performance had become more than a simple surprise. It had become something emotional, something real. As the melody continued, the wealthy guest slowly leaned back in his chair again, but his eyes never left the piano. A thoughtful smile appeared on his face. He had spent many years attending formal concerts and private events where talented musicians performed. But this moment felt different from those carefully organized performances. This was raw, unexpected, honest. He turned slightly toward the manager who was still standing nearby. "You didn't know about this?" he asked quietly. The manager shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted. "I had no idea." They both looked toward the piano again. The music had now reached its most powerful moment. Her hands moved quickly, yet every note remained clear and controlled. The melody built higher and higher, like a wave rising toward the shore. Everyone in the room could feel that the performance was reaching its final moments. The tension in the music made people hold their breath. Then suddenly the melody softened again. Her fingers slowed, guiding the music toward a calm and beautiful ending. The final notes drifted gently through the restaurant. One last soft chord echoed in the air. Then the room became silent. For a brief moment, no one moved. It felt as if the audience needed a second to return from wherever the music had taken them. The waitress kept her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her heart was beating fast, and her breathing was slightly uneven. She slowly opened her eyes. For the first time since she had started playing, she looked at the room again. Dozens of faces were staring at her. But instead of confusion or amusement, she saw something very different. Respect and admiration. Then suddenly, someone near the back of the restaurant began clapping. The sound echoed clearly in the quiet room. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant filled with applause. The clapping grew louder and louder until it felt like the walls themselves were celebrating. Some people even stood from their chairs while applauding. The waitress blinked in surprise. She had expected polite smiles at best. She had never imagined this kind of reaction. She slowly stood from the piano bench, unsure what to do next. The applause continued. At the center table, the wealthy guest stood up as well. He clapped slowly at first, then more firmly, his expression filled with genuine admiration. When the applause finally began to fade, the room still buzzed with excitement. People whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. The waitress felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention. She gave a small, shy nod toward the audience before stepping away from the piano. As she walked back toward the center of the room, the wealthy guest stepped forward slightly. His earlier playful attitude had completely disappeared. Now his voice carried a tone of sincere respect. "That," he said clearly enough for nearby tables to hear, "was extraordinary." The waitress lowered her eyes slightly, still feeling nervous. "Thank you," she said softly. But the man was not finished speaking. He studied her for a moment, as if realizing something important. Then he said something that would soon change the direction of her life once again. "You shouldn't be carrying trays," he said calmly. "You should be playing music." The words hung in the air, surprising not only her, but everyone listening nearby. For a few seconds after the applause faded, the restaurant remained full of quiet excitement. People continued whispering to each other, still amazed by what they had just witnessed. Many of them had come for a simple dinner, expecting nothing more than good food and quiet conversation. Instead, they had experienced something unforgettable. The waitress stood near the piano, unsure what to do next. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, and she could feel warmth in her face from all the attention. She had not planned for any of this. Just an hour earlier, she had been moving between tables like every other night, trying to finish her shift without mistakes. Now the entire room was looking at her in a completely different way. The wealthy guest stepped a little closer. His expression was calm, but there was clear respect in his eyes. The playful tone he had used earlier was gone. Now he looked at her the way someone looks at a talented performer. "You shouldn't be carrying trays," he repeated gently. "You should be playing music." His words made her feel both proud and uncomfortable at the same time. She gave a small nervous smile. "That's very kind of you to say," she replied quietly. But he shook his head. "I'm serious." Several people at nearby tables continued listening to the conversation with curiosity. The restaurant manager also moved a little closer, interested in what the guest was about to say next. The man placed his hands in his pockets and spoke calmly. "How long did you study piano when you were younger?" She thought for a moment. "Most of my childhood," she answered. "My father taught me." The man nodded slowly. "That explains it." She lowered her eyes slightly when she mentioned her father. Talking about those memories always carried emotion. He seemed to notice this but did not press the subject further. "Why did you stop playing?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "Life changed," she said quietly. "After my father passed away, things became difficult. I had to focus on work." The man listened carefully without interrupting. Many successful people were used to hearing stories about struggle, but this one seemed to affect him differently. He looked around the restaurant for a moment, then back at her. "You know," he said, "I have attended many private concerts. I have heard musicians who trained for years in famous schools." He paused slightly. "But what you just played had something special." She looked surprised by his words. "I was just remembering old lessons," she said softly. He smiled slightly. "Talent like that doesn't disappear," he replied. The manager spoke for the first time since the conversation began. "I had no idea she could play like that," he admitted. The man turned toward him. "Well, now you know." The manager nodded slowly, still impressed. Around them, customers were returning to their meals, but many continued glancing toward the group with interest. The waitress shifted slightly, remembering she was still on duty. "I should get back to work," she said politely. But the man raised his hand gently. "One moment." She stopped. "I'd like to ask you something," he continued. She waited quietly. "Have you ever thought about playing professionally again?" The question caught her completely off guard. She shook her head quickly. "No," she said. "That chapter of my life ended a long time ago." But he studied her carefully, as if measuring the truth behind her words. "Are you sure about that?" She did not answer right away. Deep inside, a small voice reminded her of the way she had felt while playing just minutes earlier. The joy, the freedom, the connection to something she had almost forgotten. But reality quickly returned. "I have responsibilities," she said. "A stable job matters more right now." The man understood her hesitation. Dreams often seemed impossible when someone had spent years simply trying to survive. But he also knew something else. Sometimes all a person needed was a single opportunity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. Then he handed it to her. She looked at it carefully. It contained his name and the name of a large company connected to music events and entertainment investments. "I support several music programs," he explained. "Young musicians, small concerts, even community performances." Her eyes widened slightly. "I'm not a professional musician," she said quickly. "You might be closer than you think," he replied. She looked uncertain. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "That's all right," he said calmly. "No one begins at the top." He pointed gently toward the card in her hand. "If you ever decide you want to try again, call the number on that card." The manager raised his eyebrows slightly, realizing the importance of the offer. The waitress stared at the card for a moment. Felt unreal. A single unexpected moment had opened a door she thought had been closed forever. "I don't know what to say," she admitted quietly. "You don't have to say anything now," the man replied. He gave her a friendly nod. "Just promise you'll think about it." She nodded slowly. "I will." He smiled. "Good." One of his companions stood up and stretched slightly. "We should get going," he said. The group gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Before walking toward the exit, the wealthy guest turned back one more time. "Thank you for the music tonight," he said. She smiled gently. "Thank you for listening." The men left the restaurant, disappearing into the night outside. For a moment, the room felt quieter again. The manager looked at her with a smile. "I guess tonight turned out a little different than expected," he said. She laughed softly. "Yes," she replied. She returned to work and finished the rest of her shift like usual. Plates were cleared, tables were cleaned, and the final customers slowly left. Hours later, when the restaurant finally closed, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The street was calm now, with only a few cars passing by. She looked down at the small card still resting in her hand. Under the streetlight, the letters were clear and simple. A single phone number. A single opportunity. For years she had believed her connection with music was something that belonged only to the past. But tonight had reminded her that some passions never truly disappear. Sometimes they simply wait quietly until the right moment brings them back to life. And as she stood there under the soft glow of the streetlight, she realized something important. The piano she had avoided for so many years might not be part of her past after all. It might still be part of her future.